I'd never pre-ordered a console before, but it was with the announcement of Super Bomberman R, in companionship with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, that convinced me to give the Nintendo Switch a shot. Before Super Bomberman R, it had been about 7 years since we last welcomed the heroic Bomberman and his party game antics into our homes. With Hudson Soft being absorbed by Konami in 2012, it wasn't unreasonable to think the frantic bombing action of Bomberman, which was already vacant from parties for a few years, would never be coming back. I've really enjoyed Super Bomberman R, and to say I was excited to finally play a new Bomberman game after 7 years would be an understatement. Once the game was announced, I decided to blast my way through a bunch of my favorite older Bomberman games from my childhood. After all, what better way to celebrate the return of one of the forefathers of video games after such a long absence? In a way, it was fun to go back and rediscover the things about these games I loved so much. I only have a handful of the many Bomberman games out there, and each one is just a little bit different than the last, something I really enjoy about the series. From Bomberman's Indiana Jones style outing on the original Game Boy, to the 3D action of N64's Bomberman Hero, I certainly found the Bomberman games I liked more than others, but it was interesting to revisit the PlayStation era of Bomberman most of all. For Bomberman fans on the Sony PlayStation, you had two traditional Bomberman games. The first is Bomberman Party Edition, with a heavy focus on the basic Bomberman multiplayer. The multiplayer is fun, and the single player is actually very similar to the original Bomberman game on the NES, or the TurboGrafx, with large areas full of monsters and a single power-up per level. It's classic in every way, but Bomberman Party Edition was never all that addictive to me. While Party Edition was always just kinda decent in my view, it was the other Bomberman game on the PlayStation I really liked to dig into. Bomberman World felt more like a proper update on the Bomberman presentation, and it remains to be one of my favorite Bomberman games to this day. Bomberman World is actually a sequel to another Bomberman game. During the opening cinematic, crystals emerge from the depths of 4 different planets to reveal the imprisoned Dark Force bombers. When I was a kid, I had no idea who these guys were, or why they would get a sort of upgrade during the opening movie. That's because these guys were the baddies in the Japanese exclusive tactics game Bomberman Wars on the Saturn, and they got sealed away or something, and then released and powered up by Bugler. The Dark Force bombers then fly off to conquer planets, and Bomberman has to stop them from destroying the universe and all that. It's a pretty standard plot for Bomberman, but an interesting connection to the Bomberman Wars game that we never got overseas. But at least things get a minor explanation in the game's manual. Gameplay-wise, Bomberman World is a typical Bomberman. The player starts off with a small blast that you can make more destructive with better fire and more bombs by collecting power-ups from soft blocks. There's also the bomb punching and bomb throwing gloves, the bomb kick, remote control bombs, bouncy bombs, which are a total blast to use, and others. You'll blow up enemies for points, collect crystals scattered around each stage, and make your way to the exit door to clear each level. In some Bomberman games, you'll have to defeat all the enemies to open the exit door, or even find the exit door, but Bomberman World borrows a page from games like Mega Bomberman, where you have to collect a certain number of crystals in order to beat each level. The enemies are still dangerous, of course, and stage hazards are abound in each world, so taking out all the enemies certainly make things easier to negotiate. I love the claymation-style look of Bomberman World. I guess it's more of that just weird era of 3D and sprite art mashing up, but I think Bomberman World has a sort of timeless look to its design, almost as if the characters and world are sort of a mold brought to life. The isometric view also helps this and lets Bomberman World stand out from Bomberman games released before and after it. While it can sometimes block your view of areas of the levels with trees or other structures, the isometric view doesn't inherently hinder the Bomberman gameplay, though it can be hard sometimes to anticipate the exact distance between Bomberman and an obstacle when going up and down the rows. That can be frustrating as you run into enemies that you would hope to place a bomb in front of, or if a bomb explodes near you, which, like all Bomberman games, is a hazard to always be aware of. Disappointingly, Bomberman World's 5 planets only feature 3 true levels each, followed by a confrontation with the Dark Force bomber, and then another following with their giant mechs. This means that by the time a world is really ramping up and the hazards introduced are presenting a challenge to the player, the world is over and it's time for a boss fight. The first level of each world is always pretty short and easy, but it's not unreasonable for a decent Bomberman player to negotiate their way through a whole world in 10 or so minutes. This is a huge drawback of Bomberman World, and while you can replay any level at any time or save your game at any point when you get a game over, having only 3 levels per world means that you never truly get that great Bomberman challenge. If you lose all your lives, say on a boss fight, the biggest drawback is continuing without any power-ups. But since it's so easy to quickly replay any set of levels you like, you can get powered back up and take on the boss again. Lives are hard to come by and the bosses are pretty challenging, but the actual levels, and for me, part of what makes every Bomberman game fun, quickly turn into a farming ground for better power-ups before trying to fight a boss.
See, I can crack the earth! Feel my power, Bomberman!
Speaking of bosses, they're typical Bomberman baddies, which honestly I've never been that great at outwitting. The Dark Force bombers all have a few different tricks, and Bugler himself can annoyingly teleport and show up on the same tile as Bomberman without a tell, which just really sucks.
No! You'll be sorry!
Once you beat a Dark Force bomber, you gain a piece of armor, which not only lets you take a few hits, but also has special powers. However, you'll most likely lose it during the mech boss fight that follows each Dark Force bomber, so these become tools to take down bosses and not really something you can enjoy like the Ruies and other animals from other games in the series. I realize I've actually been a little hard on Bomberman World's gameplay when at the top of this episode I said it was one of my favorite Bomberman games. I love the art style, and honestly the single player game is a nice sort of quick romp through a Bomberman game compared to more difficult ones like Super Bomberman 2, which featured a lot more levels. There is a fun challenge mode where you have to get through a training facility fighting classic Bomberman baddies in a set time limit. You can choose between 3 sets of power-ups and try to run through what can be a pretty challenging level. Your score is then ranked and you can try to tackle it again for a better grade. This is a lot of fun for the first few times, and the challenge is different depending on what loadout you select, but the level itself never really changes. Some placement of soft blocks and enemies may vary, but really nothing else. Where Bomberman World really shines is where most Bomberman games excel, the multiplayer. Bomberman World's multiplayer is incredibly fun, even against the CPU. The isometric view gives the bouts a whole new dimension of challenge. Some stages use a floating platform to change up the map hazards a little bit, but this just renders the top half of the maps visibly obstructed and unsafe. But the classic maps are great. Other maps have their own elements and hazards that are a great addition to any Bomberman battle, just like most of the Bomberman games, but the isometric view changes the way these things work a little bit, and I think it's a lot of fun. Characters in battle mode are actually characters from Bomberman Wars, and I love the different bombers you can choose from, like Merchant Bomberman, who reminds me of the shopkeepers from Dragon Quest. I can't really say that the multiplayer does anything technically more impressive than Bomberman Party Edition, but I have a lot more fun with Bomberman World's battle mode. There's a different kind of energy that I don't think I notice when I'm playing Party Edition. The action feels a lot more intense, and the different perspective and map hazards are present without sacrificing my favorite battle mode gimmicks, like revenge carts. It's a lot of fun, and it's one of the battle modes I cut my teeth on with Bomberman growing up. When I went back to play through some of these Bomberman games, Bomberman World stood out to me the most as the sort of awkward sibling. The isometric camera was different, the levels were short and easy, but the game still remains one of my favorites. I do find it interesting how much I think Bomberman World connects to Super Bomberman R. There's the kind of isometric camera and the sort of diorama sort of stage presentation, and that really reminded me a lot of Bomberman World. And in Super Bomberman R, Bugler revives previously defeated bombers for a chance at revenge, like he does with the Dark Force bombers in Bomberman World. Of course, Bomberman World may lack the Saturday morning cartoon antics of Super Bomberman R, but I can't recall another Bomberman game with such an extreme angle of view for the main gameplay. Just turning things on the side a little made Bomberman World not just another Bomberman game, but something that felt different from the console games that preceded it. If it had had the level of challenge, not to mention the amount of levels of the Super Bomberman games, Bomberman World would be one of the best games in the series. Maybe it's a lot of rose-tinted nostalgia from my younger school days of Bomberman gaming, but Bomberman World remains one of my favorite games to break out a multi-tap for. And one that hints just a little bit at a game that would eventually revive interest in the Bomberman character.